The mahogany box sat innocently in Eleanor's hands, its brass hinges tarnished from years of neglect. She'd found it while cleaning out the attic, tucked behind a stack of old tax returns in a corner Richard never let her organize. Odd, she thought, after 50 years of marriage, to discover something of his she'd never seen. Richard was downstairs watching baseball, oblivious to her discovery. His hearing had faded, but his mind remained sharp at 79, sharper than her own, she often joked. The box wasn't locked. Inside lay an unfamiliar passport, crisp and barely used. Richard's photo stared back, but the name read James Mitchell. Beneath it, a small stack of letters addressed to the same name, postmarked from Phoenix, the most recent dated just 3 months ago. Eleanor's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the top letter. Dearest James, it began in delicate handwriting. The doctors say the treatments aren't working as hoped. I've made peace with what's coming, but I need to see you one last time. Eleanor felt the room spin. She read the signature. All my love, Kathleen. 50 years of marriage, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. And now this. Evidence of another life her husband had somehow maintained in secret. Eleanor sat motionless for what felt like hours, the letter clutched in her trembling hand. Downstairs she could hear the announcer's voice rise in excitement, followed by Richard's familiar cheer. 50 years together, and now this stranger's words threatened to unravel everything. She carefully returned the letter to the envelope, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. Her mind raced with questions, each more painful than the last. Who was Kathleen? How long had this been going on? And why, after building a life together, raising children, weathering hardships, had Richard kept this secret? The stairs creaked under her feet as she descended, the mahogany box tucked under her arm. In the living room, Richard reclined in his worn leather armchair, completely absorbed in the game. Grey hair thinned at the crown of his head. Liver spots dotted his forearms, but his smile, the same one that had charmed her at a dance hall in 1972, still made her heart flutter, even now. Cubs are up by 2, he announced without looking away from the screen. When she didn't respond, he finally turned. His smile faded as he noticed the box in her hands. Where did you find that? His voice was steady, but Eleanor caught the flash of panic in his eyes. In the attic, she replied, surprised by her own calmness, behind your old tax files. She set the box on the coffee table between them, a physical manifestation of the sudden divide. Richard clicked off the television. The silence that fell was deafening. He looked at the box, then at Eleanor, his expression unreadable. Who is James Mitchell, she asked, and who is Kathleen? Richard's shoulders slumped, as if a weight he'd carried for decades had suddenly become too heavy. He rubbed his face with weathered hands, and when he lowered them, he looked older than she'd ever seen him. I never wanted you to find out this way, he said softly. I never wanted you to find out at all. Eleanor felt a chill run through her body. Find out what, exactly? Richard reached for the box, opened it with familiar ease, and ran his fingers over the passport. Before I met you, he began, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, I was someone else. Eleanor shook her head in confusion. What do you mean, someone else? James Mitchell was my name before. He hesitated, struggling to form the words. Before the accident in Phoenix, Eleanor stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man she'd known for half a century. Her husband had grown up in Chicago, had never mentioned living in Phoenix. They'd met when he was 28. He'd told her stories of his childhood, his time in college, his first job as an accountant. None of it included being someone named James Mitchell. There was a fire, Richard continued, eyes fixed on the box. A warehouse, 3 people died. I was supposed to be there, but I'd stepped out. Everyone thought I'd perished in the flames. He paused, swallowing hard. It seemed Easier to let James die that day, to become someone new. And Kathleen? Eleanor managed to ask, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Richard closed his eyes briefly. My wife. James Mitchell's wife. The room seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor. Your wife, she repeated. You were married when we met? No, Richard said quickly. Not legally, but Kathleen never knew I survived. She mourned me, buried an empty casket. By the time I realized what I'd done, how much pain I'd caused, it seemed too late to go back. He finally looked up at Eleanor, his eyes glistening. Then I met you, and I wanted to start fresh, to be worthy of the life we could have together. Eleanor felt numb. But the letters, she said, did the recent ones. Richard's face crumpled. She found me 15 years ago, a chance newspaper photo from a charity event we attended. She recognized me immediately. He took a shaky breath. She agreed to keep my secret for your sake. We've exchanged letters ever since. All this time, Eleanor whispered. 50 years of marriage and I never knew my husband. Richard reached for her hand, but she pulled away. You know me, Ellie, he pleaded. Everything between us has been real. I couldn't tell you about James, about what I'd done. Eleanor stood, needing distance. And now, Kathleen is dying, she said, more statement than question. Richard nodded, tears now flowing freely. Yes, and she wants to see me one last time. Eleanor moved to the window, staring out at the garden they'd tended together for decades. Everything familiar suddenly felt like a prop in a play she hadn't known she was part of. What else don't I know? She asked, her back still turned to him. What else have you kept from me? The Arizona heat was relentless, pressing down on the city like a physical weight. James Mitchell, now Richard Taylor, remembered it all too clearly as he sat across from Eleanor in their quiet kitchen. Outside, the Chicago evening was cool, a gentle breeze rustling through the maple tree they'd planted when Sarah was born. Their first child, one of many firsts he'd experienced with Eleanor, firsts that had come after he'd buried his past in the ashes of that warehouse. Tell me everything, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the betrayal etched across her face. She'd made tea neither of them would drink, the cups steaming between them like small barriers. Richard nodded, his throat dry. Where to begin? How to explain a life abandoned, choices made in moments of panic and opportunity? I was 25. When I married Kathleen, he started, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He hadn't spoken of this aloud in decades. She was beautiful, smart, came from money, which I didn't. Her father owned construction companies across Arizona, and he brought me in, gave me responsibilities I wasn't ready for. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. The woman who had shared his bed for 50 years now looked at him like a stranger. The warehouse was one of their storage facilities. Electrical issue, they said later. I was supposed to be overseeing a delivery that night, but I stepped out. He paused, the memory suddenly vivid. I went to buy cigarettes. I used to smoke back then. You told me you never smoked, Eleanor said quietly. Richard winced. Even the small lies hurt now. Another thing I left behind. He could still remember the smoke billowing into the night. Sky, the sirens wailing as he stood across the street, watching in horror. 3 night security guards trapped inside. The papers reported their names the next day, alongside his own. Everyone thought I died in that fire. At first, I tried to contact emergency services to tell them I wasn't inside, but then I heard people talking, saying the fire wouldn't have spread so quickly if proper safety protocols had been followed. Protocols I was responsible for. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. So you ran. I didn't plan to, Richard said, though the excuse sounded hollow even to him. I just didn't correct the mistake. I had some cash, my wallet. I drove to Tucson that night, checked into a motel. I kept thinking I'd go back the next day, explain everything. But then I saw the newspaper, my name listed among the dead, Kathleen's picture, her tear-streaked face as she identified what they thought were my remains. What remains did she identify? Eleanor asked, clinical in her questioning. Richard looked down. The medical examiner made a mistake. The bodies were badly burned. They used dental records, but there was confusion. Another man's body was identified as mine. A clock ticked somewhere in the house, marking the seconds of the uncomfortable silence. I convinced myself it was better this way, Richard continued eventually. The company had cut corners on safety equipment. I'd signed off on inspections. That never happened. If I came back, there would be investigations, maybe criminal charges. People would know I'd been negligent. So you let them blame a dead man, Eleanor concluded. Richard couldn't meet her eyes. Yes, the decision had seemed logical at the time, a panicked calculation made by a young man terrified of consequences. He'd driven east, shedding his identity with each state line he crossed. In St. Louis, he'd found someone who could get him documentation, a birth certificate, social security card. Richard Taylor was born from James Mitchell's cowardice. And then, Eleanor prompted, I came to Chicago, started over, got an entry-level job at the accounting firm. This part of the story she knew, or thought she did. 6 months later, I met you at that dance. Eleanor's eyes glistened. Was any of it real? When you told me you loved me, when you asked me to marry you, was that real, or was I just part of your new identity? Ellie, no. Richard reached across the table for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. Meeting you was the first authentic thing in my new life. Loving you made me believe I could actually be Richard Taylor, that I could be a good man despite what I'd done. But you never told me, she said, her voice breaking. 50 years, Richard. We promised no secrets. I was afraid, he admitted. At first, I thought it would destroy any chance I had with you. Then, after we were married, had the kids, the longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine telling you. I'd built this life, this family. I couldn't bear the thought of losing it all. Eleanor withdrew her hand, standing to place her untouched tea in the sink. With her back to him, she asked, How did Kathleen find you? Richard sighed. That charity gala for Sarah's hospital, 15 years ago, there was a photo in the Tribune. Kathleen's sister lived in Chicago by then, saw the paper, recognized me immediately. He remembered the shock of receiving that first letter, addressed to James Mitchell but delivered to Richard Taylor's address. The careful, measured words, I know you're alive, we need to talk. She came to Chicago? Eleanor asked. Yes, we met at a coffee shop downtown. I almost didn't go, but I owed her that much. The memory of that meeting still haunted him. Kathleen, her hair streaked with grey, but her eyes exactly as he remembered, staring at him across a table. Much like this one. The disbelief, the anger, the tears, the questions he couldn't adequately answer. She had every right to expose me, Richard said, to tell you, to go to the authorities. The statute of limitations on any charges had passed. But the scandal, the public shame. Why didn't she? Richard's voice softened. She said she'd already mourned James Mitchell once. She didn't see the point in destroying Richard Taylor too. He paused. And she didn't want to hurt you or our children. She said no wife deserves to discover her whole marriage is built on lies. Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. Yet here we are. The letters, Richard continued, they started as her way of letting me know about things in Phoenix. Her life after me, she remarried 10 years after the fire to a good man, had 2 sons, and her husband died 8 years ago. Cancer. Eleanor turned back to face him, leaning against the counter. Now she's dying too, Richard nodded. Pancreatic cancer. The treatments aren't working. He swallowed hard. She wants to see me one last time. And you want to go, Eleanor said, not a question. I don't know, Richard answered honestly. I've lived as Richard Taylor far longer than I was ever James Mitchell. But Kathleen was your wife, Eleanor finished for him. Yes. The weight of his deception filled the room, pressing against them both. 50 years of marriage suddenly viewed through a new lens. Every anniversary, every milestone now shadowed by this revelation. There's more, Eleanor said quietly. Isn't there? Richard looked up, surprised. I can see it in your face, she continued. You're still holding something back. He was. Of course he was. The secret that had truly driven his decision to disappear, to become someone else, the real reason he could never go back. Yes, he admitted, feeling the last of his carefully constructed life begin to crumble. There's more. The kitchen clock read 2:17 a.m., but neither Eleanor nor Richard had moved toward their bedroom. Sleep seemed impossible now, with 50 years of marriage suddenly suspended in uncertainty. Their children's photos watched from the walls. Sarah, Michael and Rebecca smiling through the years, unaware that their family history was built on fabrication. You need to tell me, Eleanor said, her voice hoarse from hours of talking. She'd moved to the living room couch, a physical distance from Richard that reflected the emotional chasm opening between them. Whatever it is, Richard, or James, I need to hear all of it. Now! Richard nodded, exhaustion etched in the lines of his face. He looked older tonight than she had ever seen him, as if the weight of his secrets had physically aged him in just a few hours. The warehouse fire wasn't an accident, he said finally, the words coming out like they hurt his throat. And I wasn't. Just negligent. I was complicit. Eleanor stared at him, waiting. Her husband, this stranger, owed her the complete truth. Kathleen's father, Howard Reynolds, ran his construction business like a small empire, legitimate on the surface, but underneath. Richard shook his head. There were other revenue streams. The warehouses stored more than building materials. What was he involved in? Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. Everything. Loan sharking, protection rackets, stolen goods. By the time I understood what I'd married into, I was already in too deep. Richard ran a hand through his thinning hair. Howard didn't just give me a job because I married his daughter. He needed someone with accounting skills, someone who could make dirty money look clean. Eleanor felt her breath catch. The Richard she knew, the man who volunteered at church, who helped neighborhood kids with math homework, who insisted on honesty in all their dealings, had once laundered money for organized crime. I told myself it was temporary, he continued. That once I'd proven myself to Howard, once Kathleen and I had saved enough, we could leave, start over somewhere else. A bitter smile crossed his face. The irony isn't lost on me. The fire, Eleanor prompted, needing him to continue. Richard's eyes clouded with a memory she couldn't share. There was a federal investigation getting close. Howard needed to destroy. Records, inventory that couldn't be explained. The fire was supposed to be controlled, just enough to destroy evidence, collect insurance. The guards weren't supposed to be there. But they were, Eleanor whispered. Yes. Richard's voice broke. When I left to get cigarettes, I was actually meeting with the man Howard hired to set the fire. I was supposed to confirm the building was empty, that the night security had been called off their shift. But you didn't check, Eleanor said, filling in the horrific truth. I trusted that Howard had handled it. He swore to me no one would be there. Richard's hands trembled as he spoke. When I saw the fire, realized how big it was getting, I ran back. I could hear them inside shouting for help. I tried to get in through a side door, but the heat... He closed his eyes, reliving the nightmare. I couldn't reach them. Eleanor felt sick. This wasn't just about a man who had changed his identity, who had hidden a previous marriage. This was about deaths her husband had played a role in causing. I ran, Richard admitted, shame evident in every syllable. When I heard sirens, I just ran. Got in my car and drove. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was only later, in that motel room, that I realized I could disappear, that maybe I should. And Kathleen, Eleanor asked, did she know about her father's business, about the plan for the fire? Richard hesitated, then shook his head. No. Kathleen knew her father operated in grey areas, but not the extent of it. She certainly didn't know about the fire being deliberate. So you left her to mourn you while protecting yourself, Eleanor said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. You let her identify someone else's body as yours, attend a funeral, grieve, all to save yourself from consequences. Yes, Richard admitted, the single word carrying the weight of his guilt, but also to protect her. If I had come forward, if the truth about the fire had come out, Howard wouldn't have hesitated to silence me, and Kathleen would have been caught. Between her husband and her father, Eleanor tried to process this information, to reconcile it with the man she'd built a life with. When Kathleen found you 15 years ago, did you tell her this truth about her father, about the fire? Richard nodded slowly. I had to. She deserved that much, at least. He paused. Howard had died by then. Heart attack, 5 years after. The fire. And she kept your secret anyway, even knowing you were partially responsible for those deaths? It wasn't simple forgiveness, Richard said. She was furious, devastated. But she'd also had years to learn about her father's true business. Dealings. After his death, a lot came to light. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the memory. She told me she'd carry the knowledge of what I'd done, what we'd all done, to her grave, that exposing me wouldn't bring those men back. Eleanor stood abruptly, needing to move, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with decades of lies. She walked to the window, staring out at their quiet street, their normal neighborhood. How many other homes held secrets like this? How many other marriages were built on carefully constructed false foundations? All these years, she said, her back to him, I thought I knew you. Every time you spoke about honesty to our children, every time you made some moral stand, was that guilt? Were you trying to atone? Richard was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was barely audible. I think I was trying to become the man you thought I was, he said, the man I wished I had been from the beginning. She turned to face him. In the dim light of their living room, he looked small, diminished, the confident husband and father stripped away to reveal someone more complex, more flawed than she had ever imagined. Did you ever plan to tell me? She asked. If Kathleen wasn't dying, if I hadn't found that box, would you have taken this to your grave? Richard met her gaze, and for once, Eleanor saw complete honesty in his eyes. Yes, he said simply, I would have. The admission hung between them, the final confirmation that their marriage, for all its joy, its shared history, its love, had been founded on a fundamental deception. Kathleen's letter, Eleanor said after a long moment. She wants to see you before she dies, Richard nodded. She has weeks, maybe less. Her son with her second husband, wrote to me as well, said she's asking for me. Are you going? The question felt enormous, weighted with implications neither of them could fully grasp yet. Richard looked up at her, and Eleanor saw uncertainty there. A man caught between two lives, two women, two versions of himself. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what's right anymore. Eleanor nodded, a strange calm settling over her despite the turmoil of the night's revelations. If you do, she said carefully, I'm coming with you. Richard's eyes widened. Ellie, no, she cut him off. I've lived 50 years with a man I thought I knew completely. If I'm going to decide whether that life was real, whether our marriage means what I thought it did, I need to see all of you, including the parts you left in Phoenix. Richard seemed about to argue, then stopped himself. After a lifetime of deception, perhaps he recognized that he had forfeited the right to make this decision alone. "Okay," he agreed quietly. Eleanor turned back to the window, watching as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. For 50 years, she had been Mrs. Richard Taylor. Now she had to decide who that made her, in light of learning. Her husband had never truly been Richard Taylor at all. Behind her, she heard Richard shift in his chair. "What happens now, Ellie?" he asked, his voice revealing a vulnerability she rarely heard from him. Eleanor continued to look out at the breaking day, her reflection ghostly in the window glass. "Now," she said softly, "we go to Phoenix, and I meet the wife who mourned you." Journey to the Past. I'm James Mitchell. The words sounded foreign, coming from Richard's mouth as he practiced in the passenger seat. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the highway stretching before them, the Arizona desert unfurling in all directions. They'd flown to Phoenix that morning, rented a car at the airport, and now drove in tense silence toward the address they'd been given. 2 days had passed since Eleanor's ultimatum. Their children remained unaware. She'd insisted on that. "Let's understand this ourselves before we upend their world too," she'd said, and Richard had readily agreed. The suburb where Kathleen lived looked like any other, neat houses with desert landscaping, palm trees swaying gently. Eleanor parked outside a modest single-story home with a ramp leading to the front door. "Ready?" she asked, not entirely sure if she was asking Richard or herself. Richard stared at the house, his face pale. "I never thought I'd be back here." A young man opened the door before they could knock, mid-30s, with kind eyes that widened when he saw Richard. "My God," he whispered, "you look just like the photos." "Mark," Richard said, recognizing Kathleen's son from the letters. "Thank you for—" Mark nodded, understanding the unfinished thought. "She's waiting in the sunroom. Been sitting there all morning." He looked at Eleanor with obvious curiosity. "I'm Eleanor," she said simply. "Richard's wife." Mark seemed momentarily confused by her presence, but quickly recovered. "She'll want to meet you too." Eleanor followed the men through the house, noting family photos that tracked a life parallel to her own. A woman with children growing up, celebrations, graduations. A life that could have included Richard had things been different. They entered a bright room at the back of the house, and there she was, Kathleen Mitchell, propped up in a recliner, wrapped in a light blanket despite the heat. Her face was gaunt, her body diminished by illness, but her eyes were clear and alert. Those eyes fixed on Richard with an intensity that made Eleanor's chest tighten. "James," Kathleen said, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. "You came." Richard stopped a few feet from her chair, visibly shaken. "Hello, Kathleen." Eleanor stood back, suddenly an outsider in a reunion 50 years in the making. Watching her husband's face as he looked at his first wife, she saw emotions she couldn't fully interpret. Grief, guilt, and something else. Recognition of a shared past that Eleanor would never be part of. "And you must be Eleanor," Kathleen said, turning those penetrating eyes toward her. "The woman who got to live with my husband all these years. 3 lives collide." "Please sit," Kathleen gestured to the chairs positioned near her recliner. Her hands were thin, veins prominent against pale skin. "We have much to discuss." Eleanor took the seat beside Richard, their shoulders nearly touching yet worlds apart. The sunroom was warm, filled with potted succulents and desert light. "I didn't expect you to bring your wife," Kathleen said to Richard, her tone not unkind but direct. "I didn't expect to come at all," Richard replied. A small smile touched Kathleen's lips. "Yet here we are, the 3 of us." Mark discreetly excused himself, closing the door as he left. "You look well, James," Kathleen observed. "Life as Richard Taylor suited you." Eleanor watched her husband flinch at the name. "Kathleen, No need for apologies now, Kathleen interrupted. I didn't ask you here for that. Time is something I don't have to waste. She reached for a folder beside her chair, wincing with the effort. Richard instinctively moved to help, then hesitated, uncertain of boundaries after so many years. These are for you, Kathleen said, opening the folder to reveal legal documents. I've amended my will. My letter wasn't just about seeing you, though God knows I needed that. It's about my son, our son. Richard went completely still. What? Eleanor felt the room tilt beneath her. Daniel, Kathleen said, born 7 months after your death. He's 50 now, with children of his own. He doesn't know about you. I never told him, but he deserves the truth. Richard's breathing grew shallow. I had a son? All this time? You have a son, Kathleen corrected, and he has a right to know his father before I'm gone. Eleanor found her voice at last. Where is he now? Seattle, Kathleen answered, looking at Eleanor with something like respect. He's flying in tomorrow. I told him I have important family matters to discuss. She handed Richard a photograph of a tall man with familiar eyes. I thought I buried my husband, she said softly. Instead, I raised his child alone. Richard stared at the photo, tears streaming unchecked down his face. Eleanor took her husband's hand, surprising herself. The man she'd married had just discovered another child, a first son he never knew existed. Yet watching him confront the fullness of what he'd abandoned, she felt not anger, but an unexpected compassion. Will you stay? Kathleen asked. Meet him? Richard looked to Eleanor, a silent question in his tear-filled eyes. Yes, Eleanor answered for them both. We'll stay. Richard barely slept that night in the hotel. Eleanor watched him pace, rehearsing, explanations that fell flat even to his own ears. How do you tell a 50-year-old man you're the father who supposedly died before his birth? I'll be there, Eleanor promised, though she wasn't sure if her presence would help or complicate matters. Kathleen's home felt different the next day, tense with anticipation. They arrived early, at Kathleen's request. I want to speak with him first, she explained. They heard the car pull up, the front door open. Mark's voice, then another, deeper, with a slight question in its tone. Footsteps approached. The man who entered was unmistakably Richard's son. The same height, the same set of the jaw, even the way he tilted his head as he took in the scene. Before him, Mom? Daniel looked from Kathleen to the strangers in her sunroom. What's going on? Kathleen reached for her son's hand. Daniel, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago. Richard stood, legs unsteady. Hello, Daniel. The younger man stared, confusion turning to shock as understanding dawned in his eyes. He'd seen photos of his supposedly dead father. The resemblance was undeniable. That's not possible, Daniel whispered. I'm James Mitchell, Richard said, his voice breaking. I'm your father. Daniel took a step back, his face hardening. My father died before I was born. No, Kathleen said gently. He didn't. As Kathleen explained, Daniel's expression shifted from disbelief to anger to a stunned silence that filled the room. When she finished, he turned to Richard. 50 years, he said flatly. You've been alive for 50 years. Richard had no adequate response, no justification that could bridge half a century of absence. Daniel looked at Eleanor. And you? Did you know about any of this? No, she answered quietly. Not until a few days ago. Daniel nodded, processing. Then without warning, he turned and walked out. 3 days passed with no word from Daniel. Richard and Eleanor extended their stay, moving from the hotel to a nearby rental condo. Time felt suspended as they waited for a call that might never come. I should go back, Richard said one evening, staring out at the unfamiliar skyline. Find him, try to explain. And say what? Eleanor asked gently. He needs time. Richard nodded, defeated. His phone rang, startling them both. Unknown number. Hello? It's Daniel. Pause. Can we meet, just us? Richard looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, he said. Tell me where. The next morning, Richard met his son at a quiet coffee shop. Daniel was already seated when he arrived, too untouched, and coffee's on the table. I have questions, Daniel said without preamble. I need honest answers. For the next 2 hours, Richard gave him exactly that, the complete, unvarnished truth about the warehouse fire, his escape, the new identity. The cowardice, the regret. Daniel listened, asking sharp, precise questions that reminded Richard painfully of Kathleen. I don't forgive you, Daniel finally said, but I understand better now. It wasn't absolution, but it was something. Eleanor's decision. While Richard met with Daniel, Eleanor visited Kathleen alone. The women sat in the sunroom, each measuring the other. He's a good man, Kathleen said unexpectedly. The man you know, he's not the same one who left me. Eleanor struggled with conflicting emotions. How can you be so understanding? Kathleen's smile was tired but genuine. Dying clarifies things. I've had 15 years to process who James was, who Richard became. She leaned forward. The question is, what will you do now? Eleanor had been asking herself the same thing. 50 years of marriage against this revelation. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I know I need to decide for myself, not out of pride or hurt. Kathleen nodded. That's why he loves you. You see clearly. When Eleanor left, the two women embraced, a gesture that would have seemed impossible days before. Family echoes, Richard and Eleanor's children, grew increasingly concerned by their parents' extended vacation in Phoenix. Sarah, their eldest, finally called, demanding answers. Mum, what's going on? Dad sounds strange. Are you both okay? Eleanor closed her eyes, phone pressed to her ear. We're dealing with something from your father's past. We'll explain everything. When we return, is he sick? Are you getting divorced? Sarah's voice rose with worry. No, Eleanor said, surprising herself with her certainty on the second point. We're not getting divorced, but things are complicated. Meanwhile, Daniel introduced Richard to his own children. Richard's grandchildren he never knew existed. Watching his son with his family, Richard glimpsed an alternate life, paths not taken, joys he'd forfeited. Yet when he looked at photos of Sarah, Michael and Rebecca, showed them proudly to Daniel, he couldn't regret the family he'd built. With Eleanor, somehow both realities were true. Kathleen's farewell, Kathleen's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next week. The doctor's predictions had been accurate. She had little time left. Richard sat with her one evening while Mark took a rare break, and Eleanor gave them privacy. Kathleen's breathing was labored, but her mind remained sharp. No regrets, she told him, gripping his hand weakly. Not anymore. I have enough for both of us, Richard replied. She shook her head slightly. Don't. Your life with Eleanor, it's been good, real. Our time was another life ago. Daniel will be fine, she interrupted. He's strong, like me. A hint of her old spark showed through. He may never fully forgive you, but he'll know you. That matters. 3 days later, Kathleen passed peacefully in her sleep. Richard stood with Daniel at the funeral, Eleanor beside him. A family fractured and partially mended, brought together by a truth long buried. As they lowered Kathleen's casket, Richard felt a strange sense of completion. The wife he'd abandoned had finally, properly, been laid to rest, not by a coward fleeing responsibility, but by a man facing his past. Coming home. The flight back to Chicago was quiet, both Richard and Eleanor lost in thought. They'd said goodbye. To Daniel with promises to stay in touch, to build whatever relationship was possible after so much lost time. Eleanor had watched Richard with their newfound family, seen his grief, his regret, but also glimpses of James Mitchell, the man he'd been before. Surprisingly, she found she didn't hate that man despite his flaws. He was part of the husband she'd loved for 50 years. As they pulled into their driveway, Richard turned to her. "I'll understand if you want me to leave." Eleanor studied his face, older now, lined with experience and worry, but still the face she'd woken up to for half a century. "We're going to tell our children everything," she said firmly. "Together, no more secrets." Richard nodded, relief and apprehension mingling in his expression. And then Eleanor continued, taking his hand. "We'll figure out what comes next. I'm not throwing away 50 years, Richard, but I need to know who I've really been married to all this time." "I'm both of them," Richard said quietly. "James and Richard. The man who ran, and the man who stayed. The coward, and the father who raised our children. I don't know how to separate them anymore." Eleanor nodded, understanding at last. "Then that's who we'll learn to live with, both of you." As they walked to their front door, Eleanor realized the strangest truth of all in discovering her husband's shocking double life. She'd finally met the whole man, and somehow, despite everything, she still chose him. Truth and reconciliation. The living room felt too small for the weight of the conversation about to take place. Eleanor had arranged the furniture to accommodate their three children, Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca, who sat perched on the edge of their seats, faces tight with concern. Richard stood by the fireplace, fingers tracing the edge of the mantel where family photos chronicled decades of shared history. Birthday celebrations, graduations, weddings, the birth of grandchildren. Evidence of a life well lived, but one built on a foundation of secrets now crumbling beneath them. "You're scaring us," Sarah finally said, breaking the tense silence. At 52, she was the spitting image of Eleanor, practical, direct, with the same penetrating gaze that could cut through pretense. "Just tell us what's going on. Is it health issues, financial problems?" Michael, their middle child, leaned forward. "Whatever it is, we can help. That's what family does." Rebecca, the youngest at 43, said nothing, but her eyes never left her father's face. She had always been the most intuitive of their children, the one who sensed undercurrents others missed. Richard looked to Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. This moment had played in his mind countless times during the flight home, yet now that it had arrived, words failed him. "I haven't been entirely truthful with you," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "With any of you, including your mother." He started at the beginning. Phoenix, the warehouse fire, his escape and reinvention as Richard Taylor. The words came easier than expected, as if some part of him had been waiting 50 years to release this burden. He spoke of Kathleen, of the recent discovery of Daniel's existence, of the trip to Arizona that had brought them face to face with his abandoned past. Their children's expressions shifted as the story unfolded, shock giving way to disbelief, then confusion, anger, and finally a stunned silence that filled the room when he finished speaking. "This can't be real," Sarah said, shaking her head. "Dad, you're telling us your entire identity is a lie, that you were involved in criminal activity, that we have a half-brother we never knew about?" "Yes," Richard answered simply. Michael stood, abruptly, pacing the perimeter of the room. "Who does this? Who lives a double life for 50 years? How could you do this to Mom, to us?" "Your father made terrible mistakes," Eleanor interjected, her voice calm but firm. "He's not denying that. But the life we built together, the love he's shown all of you, that was real." Rebecca, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. "Did you ever plan to tell us? If Kathleen hadn't been dying, if Mom hadn't found that box, Would we ever have known? The question echoed the one Eleanor had asked days before. Richard met his youngest daughter's gaze, unable to offer anything but honesty now. "No," he admitted, "I wouldn't have told you." Rebecca nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she had already known. "And this half-brother of ours, Daniel, what does he think of all this?" "He's angry," Richard said, "confused, trying to make sense of it just like you are." "Will we meet him?" This from Michael, who had stopped pacing to lean against the wall, arms crossed defensively over his chest. Richard glanced at Eleanor before answering. "That's up to him and to you. He knows about you and he's open to the possibility, but he's still processing everything." Sarah turned to her mother, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mom, how are you so calm about this? Dad's been lying to you for your entire marriage." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand. "I've had a little more time to absorb the shock. And yes, I've been angry. Furious, actually. Part of me still is." She looked at Richard, her expression complex but not cold. "But I've also had to ask myself what these 50 years have meant, if they're invalidated by what came before." "And?" Michael pressed. "And I've decided they're not," Eleanor said firmly. "Your father made inexcusable choices as a young man. He ran from his responsibilities, his mistakes. But the man who raised you, who has been my husband all these years, he's been trying to atone for those choices every day, even if we didn't know it." Richard felt his throat tighten at her words, a grace he hadn't dared hope for. Rebecca stood and crossed to her father, studying his face as if seeing him for the first time. "You're still my dad," she said finally. "But you're also this other person I never knew existed. I don't know how to reconcile that." "I understand," Richard said softly. "I'm still trying to reconcile it myself." Sarah remained rigid on the couch, her expression hardening. "This isn't something we just forgive and forget over Sunday dinner, Dad. You were involved in something that killed people. You abandoned a pregnant wife. You've been living under a false identity our entire lives." "I know," Richard acknowledged. "I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness. I just needed you to know the truth. All of it. Where you go from here is up to each of you." Michael shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. 50 years of honesty is the best policy lectures from a man living a complete lie. That's rich, Dad." The words stung, but Richard accepted them as his due. "You're right. I've been a hypocrite. But he's also been the father who taught you integrity precisely because he understood its value," Eleanor added. "Sometimes our deepest convictions come from our greatest failures." The conversation continued for hours, questions circling back, emotions flaring and subsiding like waves. Sarah's anger remained the sharpest, Michael's confusion the most persistent, while Rebecca retreated into a watchful silence, absorbing every word. By the time their children left, Sarah the first to go, Michael lingering to ask more questions, Rebecca the last, embracing both parents with a fierceness that spoke of determination not to lose them. Richard felt hollowed out, emptied of secrets, but uncertain what would fill the space they'd occupied. Eleanor closed the door behind Rebecca, then turned to face him. The house seemed too quiet now, echoing with unresolved questions. "That went about as well as could be expected," she said, exhaustion evident in her voice. Richard nodded. "Better than I deserved." Eleanor moved to stand before him, taking his hands in hers, a gesture so familiar yet now freighted with new meaning. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There will be more questions, more anger. They need time." "I know," Richard said. "What about you, Ellie? Where are we?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "We're in uncharted territory," she said, finally. 50 years into a marriage that I'm only now truly understanding. I meant what I told the children. I believe in what we've built together. But I also need to find my footing in this new reality." Richard nodded, grateful even for this uncertain hope. "Whatever you need," he promised, "however long it takes." As they moved through their evening routine, brushing teeth side by side, at the bathroom sink, turning down covers, adjusting pillows, Richard was struck by the strange duality of his existence. These domestic habits, accumulated over decades of shared life, now performed by two people getting to know each other all over again. When Eleanor reached to turn off her bedside lamp, she paused, looking at him in the soft glow. "I have one. More question," she said. "Who are you going to be now, Richard or James?" He hadn't considered this, the practical question of identity after revelation. "I've been Richard Taylor far longer than I was ever James Mitchell," he said slowly. "But maybe I need to acknowledge both, the man I was and the man I've become." Eleanor nodded, as if his answer satisfied something important. "Good night, then," she said, switching off the light. In the darkness, Richard felt her hand find his. Across the space between them, a small bridge across a gap he had feared might be unbridgeable. "Good night, Ellie," he whispered back, holding onto her hand like the lifeline it had always been. New beginnings. Spring arrived in Chicago with tentative warmth, green shoots pushing through soil still cold from winter. It had been 3 months since the revelation of Richard's past life, 3 months of careful readjustments and fragile rebuilding. The Taylor family, now expanded in ways none of them could have anticipated, moved through this new reality. With varying degrees of acceptance and resistance, Sarah remained the most distant, her calls brief and formal. She had always idolized her father, and his fall from that pedestal had hit her hardest. Michael had chosen a more analytical approach, researching the warehouse fire, digging into newspaper archives as if understanding every detail might help him process the truth. Rebecca had surprised them all with her steadfast presence, stopping by the house more frequently than before, watching her parents with quiet attentiveness. Eleanor had settled into a new routine with Richard, one marked by greater honesty. They talked more deeply now, conversations extending late into the night as they re-examined their shared history through this new lens. Some nights were easier than others. Sometimes anger would resurface, sharp and sudden, and Eleanor would need space. Richard always gave it, grateful for the chance to earn back her trust. "Daniel called this morning," Richard mentioned over breakfast. They sat at their kitchen table, spring sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the steam rising from their coffee cups. "He's considering a business trip to Chicago next month." Eleanor looked up from her newspaper. "Will you see him?" Richard nodded, still marveling at the strange reality of having a 50-year-old son he was just getting to know. "He asked if we would have dinner. Both of us." "Both?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "He specifically mentioned you," Richard confirmed. "Said he'd like to get to know you better." Their first meeting in Phoenix had been brief, emotionally charged. Daniel had been polite to Eleanor, but understandably focused on the father he'd thought dead his entire life. That he now wanted to include her felt significant. "I'd like that," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to touch Richard's hand. These casual touches had slowly returned to their relationship, not with the unthinking ease of before, but with deliberate choice. Each one felt like crossing a threshold, a small act of forgiveness. The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Richard rose to answer it, expecting the mail carrier with a package. Instead, he found Sarah standing on the porch, her expression guarded but determined. "Sarah," he said, surprise evident in his voice. Their eldest daughter hadn't visited since the day of their family meeting. "Come in." "Is Mom here?" Sarah asked, stepping into the foyer. "In the kitchen," Richard replied, gesturing down the hallway. He followed her, noting the stiffness in her posture, the way she didn't quite meet his eyes. Eleanor's face brightened upon seeing her daughter. "Sarah, this is a nice surprise." Sarah placed her purse on the counter, movements precise and controlled. "I didn't call first. I hope that's okay." "Of course," Eleanor assured her. "Sit. I'll pour you coffee." Richard settled back into his chair, watching his daughter take the seat across from him. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. The weight of his deception bore heavily on all of them, but Sarah carried it like a personal betrayal. As the firstborn, she had always felt responsible for maintaining family harmony. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Sarah began, wrapping her hands around the mug Eleanor placed before her, "about everything you told us, about who you are, Dad, or whoever you are." Richard nodded, accepting the barb within her words. "I kept asking myself how I could have missed it, if there were signs I should have seen." Sarah stared into her coffee. "I'm a corporate lawyer. I analyze people for a living, look for inconsistencies, hidden agendas. But my own father," she trailed off, shaking her head. "You couldn't have known," Eleanor said gently. "He kept this hidden from everyone, including me." Sarah looked up, meeting her mother's gaze. "That's what Thomas said too." Thomas was Sarah's husband of 26 years, a psychology professor with a deliberate way of considering complex problems. Richard had always appreciated his son-in-law's measured approach to life. "He thinks I'm being too hard on you," Sarah continued, finally looking directly at Richard. "Says people are complex, that we can hold contradictory truths simultaneously, that you can be both the father who raised me and the other man you were." Richard felt a surge of gratitude toward Thomas. "He sounds very wise," he said cautiously. "He also said I should ask you the questions I've been avoiding instead of trying to answer them myself." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "So that's why I'm here." Eleanor started to rise. "I should give you two some privacy." "No," Sarah said, quickly. "Stay, Mom. Please. This involves you too." Eleanor settled back into her chair, reaching for Richard's hand under the table. He held on, drawing strength from her presence. "Ask me anything," Richard told his daughter. "I'll answer as honestly as I can." Sarah took a deep breath. "Did you ever regret marrying Mom? Did you wish you could go back to your old life, to Kathleen?" The question cut straight to a fear Richard hadn't even acknowledged to himself. He considered his answer carefully, knowing his daughter deserved complete honesty, not comfortable reassurance. "In the early years, there were moments," he admitted, feeling Eleanor's hand tighten around his. "Moments of wondering what might have happened if I'd had the courage to go back, to face the consequences. But those thoughts were never about wishing I hadn't married your mother. They were about wishing I had been brave enough to resolve my past properly before starting a new life." He turned slightly toward Eleanor. "I never regretted choosing your mother, Sarah. Not for a moment. What I regretted was the lie that always stood between us, the truth I couldn't share." Sarah studied his face, searching for insincerity. "And the warehouse fire, those men who died. Did you regret that?" Richard felt the familiar surge of shame that had accompanied him for 50 years. "Every day," he said quietly. "Their names were Joseph Ramirez, Donald Curtis, and Wei Chen. I learned them from the newspaper the morning after. I've never forgotten them." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at this detail. "You remember their names?" "I've carried them with me," Richard acknowledged. "When your children were born, when I watched you all grow up safe and loved, I would think of them, of the futures they lost, the families they left behind. It doesn't change what happened, but I've tried to live a life that honors their memory in some way." Eleanor spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Your father donated anonymously to a scholarship fund for the children of workplace accident victims every year on the anniversary of the fire. I never knew why that date was significant to him until now." Sarah looked at her mother in surprise. "You knew about the donations?" "I handled our finances," Eleanor explained. "I knew about the donations, just not the reason behind them." Richard hadn't realized Eleanor had noted the pattern of those contributions. It was one of many ways he had attempted private atonement over the decades, inadequate but necessary for his own conscience. "There's something else," Sarah said, reaching into her purse. She withdrew a folded document, placing it carefully on the table. "I had a DNA test done." Richard felt a cold rush of apprehension. If Sarah had submitted her DNA to one of those ancestry services, there might be connections to his birth family, to his original identity. "I needed to know if there were other secrets," Sarah explained, unfolding the paper. "Other siblings out. There's somewhere evidence of who you really are." "And?" Richard asked, voice barely audible. "And it confirmed you're related to Daniel." Sarah pushed the document toward him. "I sent him a message after you told us about him. We've been in contact. He agreed to a private test." Eleanor gasped softly. "You've been talking to Daniel? For how long?" "Almost 2 months," Sarah admitted. "At first, I just wanted confirmation. Then we found we had a lot in common. He's a patent attorney, did you know that? Different field from corporate law, but similar mindset." Richard stared at the paper before him, the scientific confirmation of what he already knew, that Daniel was his biological son. Seeing it in black and white, however, made it undeniably real in a new way. "Why didn't you tell us you were in contact with him?" Eleanor asked, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "I needed to do this on my terms, to understand this new reality without—" she gestured vaguely between her parents, "without filtering it through your experiences." Richard nodded, understanding completely. Sarah had always needed to process difficult situations in her own way, on her own timeline. "Daniel's coming to Chicago," Sarah continued. "He mentioned he told you about his business trip. What he probably didn't mention is that Michael, Rebecca, and I have arranged to have dinner with him the night before he sees you." Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, gratitude, a strange jealousy that his children were forming relationships with Daniel independent of him, and underlying it all, profound relief that they were accepting this new extension of their family. "That's wonderful," he said sincerely. Sarah's expression remained serious. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you, Dad. I'm still working through what all this means for me, for my understanding of our family. But I'm trying to move forward." "That's all any of us can do," Eleanor said gently. "Move forward with the truth, however complicated it is." Sarah nodded, then surprised them both by reaching across the table to take Richard's free hand. "I miss my dad," she said, voice catching slightly. "The dad I thought I knew. I'm trying to reconcile him with who you really are." Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "I'm still him, Sarah. That part wasn't a lie. The man who taught you to ride a bike, who helped you with calculus homework, who walked you down the aisle, that was the real me." "Maybe," Sarah conceded, "or maybe it was the man you were becoming, the man you wanted to be." It was an insight worthy of Thomas's influence, perceptive and nuanced. Richard squeezed his daughter's hand gently. "You might be right about that." The conversation shifted then, moving to lighter topics. Sarah's work, her children's activities, plans for the upcoming summer. By the time she left an hour later, something had changed between them. Not healed entirely, but nudged toward mending. As Richard closed the front door behind her, Eleanor wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. He covered her hands with his own, overwhelmed by the simple comfort of her embrace. "She's coming around," Eleanor murmured. "They all are in their own ways," Richard agreed. "More than I deserve." Eleanor moved around to face him, her hands framing his face. "Stop saying that. Yes, you made terrible mistakes. Yes, you lived a lie. But you also created a good life, Richard. You are a good father, a good husband. Both things, and can be true. Richard leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "How did I get so lucky with you, Ellie? Twice in my life I've had extraordinary women love me far better than I deserved. Perhaps that's your real penance," Eleanor suggested, a hint of wry humor in her voice. "Living up to that love." The moment was interrupted by the telephone. Eleanor stepped away to answer it, and Richard wandered into the living room, his gaze falling on the family photos that lined the mantel. Now that his children knew the truth, now that Eleanor had chosen to stay despite everything, these images felt authentic in a way they hadn't before. No longer documentation of a carefully constructed fiction, but evidence of a complicated, imperfect but genuine family. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "That was Daniel," she said. "He wants to come earlier than planned, next week." Richard turned to her, surprised. "Did he say why?" "He found something in Kathleen's papers," Eleanor explained. "Something he thinks you should see. He didn't elaborate, but he sounded urgent." A flicker of apprehension passed through Richard. What else could there be? What other secrets had Kathleen kept? Eleanor crossed the room to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his as they both gazed at the family photos. "Whatever it is," she said softly, "we'll face it together." Richard nodded, grateful beyond words for her use of we. After 50 years of marriage, 3 months of painful truth, and countless moments of quiet reckoning, Eleanor still chose to stand beside him. It was more than he had hoped for, more than he had any right to expect. "Together," he agreed, taking her hand. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal, coaxing new life from the remnants of winter. Inside, a family fractured by decades of secrets took its first tentative steps toward a similar rebirth, not erasing the past, but growing something new from its complex soil. Daniel would arrive with whatever revelation Kathleen had left behind. Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca would continue their careful reassessment of the father they thought they knew, and Richard and Eleanor would navigate this uncharted territory together day by day, truth by truth, finding their way forward. For Richard, Taylor, once James Mitchell, it was a second chance he had never expected, and a reconciliation he had never dared to hope for. Not redemption, perhaps, but something equally precious, the opportunity to live the remainder of his life in full honesty with those he loved most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, perhaps even new pain. But for now, standing beside Eleanor in the home they had built together, Richard allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten during 50 years of hiding. Peace. Daniel arrived with a worn leather journal clutched in his hands. Richard and Eleanor welcomed him into their home, tension hanging in the air. "I found this among Mom's things," Daniel said, placing the journal on the coffee table. Her private diary from the year after the fire. Richard stared at it apprehensively. "What does it say?" "She knew, Dad." Daniel's voice was quiet but clear. "She knew you weren't in the warehouse that night." Richard's breath caught. "What?" "She saw you," Daniel continued, "across the street watching the fire. She was there, looking for you. But she didn't approach you because—" He hesitated. "Because," Eleanor prompted. "Because she wanted you to have a chance to escape." Daniel opened the journal to a marked page. "She writes here that she knew about her father's business dealings. She knew you were being set up to take the fall, if anything went wrong." Richard sat heavily on the couch. "She let me go." "She protected you," Daniel corrected. "And she kept your secret all those years, even from me." "But when she found me again?" Richard asked. "She wanted to see if you'd built a life worthy of her sacrifice," Daniel said. "And when she met Eleanor, saw your family, she had her answer." Eleanor reached for Richard's hand. "She gave you a second chance." "And now she's given us one too," Richard realized, looking between his wife and newfound son. Outside, summer light bathed the garden where their extended family would gather this evening. All of Richard's children meeting as siblings for the first time. Not an ending, but a new chapter. Neither Richard Taylor nor James Mitchell could have imagined. Some secrets destroy, others finally revealed can heal. Subscribe for more.